Hey, good morning.
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 Kind of a early morning for most of us.
Yeah, I'm in Seattle. It's very early.
Oh my gosh. 4:30 in Seattle?
Yeah, 4:30 in Seattle. I'm in Seattle. It's very early.
Oh my gosh. That's the live stream lag.
Yeah, I muted it. I had forgotten.
I'm still in the middle of making coffee.
Oh, I think we've talked about it before. I've gone through all of undergrad and grad school without coffee.
That's
Most impressive
pretty
achievement of all.
impressive.
With no tea or anything?
Not caffeinated ones.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, how are you?
Good morning.
Hey, everyone. Hey, Mark, how do you, you're the chair, right?
Yeah.
Do you, are you gonna make time for me to introduce Michael, or how do you do it?
However you would like to do it. If you'd like to spend however much time you want to do on the introductions, that would be great.
Yeah, I figured just a brief introduction of him, and I don't know if you introduced the team, like the qualifiers, but I'd like to just spend a few minutes. I don't want to take too much time. I don't know. I know we don't have a ton.
That would be very nice. But it looks like we've got our committee. So maybe give the audience a bit more time to come in.
I think we should just start at 4:30. I think we can get going with introductions at 4:30, and then the talk will start, what, 5 minutes after that, probably?
Peter, are there anything official we need to do that you know of, or?
Nope, you've got it all under control. Dr. Johnson will introduce, Michael will begin. That sounds great.
So I'll just maybe spend a little bit of time explaining the format. So we're going to aim for roughly an hour of talk and audience questions. Does that sound about right?
That's the goal.
Okay.
Just let me know when to start.
So actually, that's helpful for me to clarify, Mark. So audience questions come first?
Yeah.
And then committee? Okay.
Yeah, then we'll kick them out.
Then we go closed door, right, for committee? We go closed door for committee.
Okay.
I think Mark dismisses the audience, right?
For committee questions.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then we go closed door for committee.
Okay.
Oh, and Michael, please don't forget to close the recording after everybody leaves.
Yep.
Thanks.
Stop recording, stop YouTube. Nobody can know the mystery of what happens inside of these closed door meetings. Perhaps little bunny rabbits are sacrificed. I don't know.
All right, looks like we hit 7:30. Let me just kick things off. My name is Mark Yim. I'm going to be chair of Michael's Thesis Defense. We've got Conrad Cording and Laura Prosser and Michelle Johnson, the other professors involved. So just a quick note on the format. We will have roughly an hour for the presentation and audience to ask questions. The committee may also ask questions, public questions at that point, and then we will ask everyone to, all the audience to leave so we can have our private committee questions and go from there. Michelle, you'd like to introduce Michael?
Yes, it's with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce my doctoral student, Michael Soprapera. Michael joined our lab, the Rehab Robotics Lab, in the fall of 2016. And it's been a long haul, but just a pleasure having Michael as a critical part of the lab. It was a pleasure seeing him grow to this point. And I'm excited about the work that he's produced. He's going to be presenting social robot augmented telepresence for remote assessment and rehabilitation of patients with upper extremity impairment. And I am just excited that he has made it to this point, and I look forward to sharing what he's done with everyone today. And I'm excited for what Michael will show in terms of the culmination of his work. So without further ado, I let Michael present his dissertation thesis defense.
Great, thank you. And thanks everybody for coming. I'm excited to show you all what I've been working on for nearly 6 years. So like Dr. Johnson said, I'm presenting our work on social robot augmented telepresence for remote assessment and rehabilitation of patients with upper extremity impairment. So I think the first thing to discuss is what I mean by upper extremity impairment. And we're talking about things that prevent someone from using their upper extremities, so their hand, wrist, arm, shoulder, due to some sort of injury. So we could be talking about stroke, cerebral palsy, or other things. Here's the first two examples, stroke and cerebral palsy. And so you can see people getting rehab for those. On the right side of your screen, there's a little girl. You can see her left hand is kind of clenched. She has some spasticity there, so some tightness. You oftentimes see loss of control. So you can see on the left side of your screen, reduced strength. And all these things are treated through rehab amongst other modalities. And rehab is going to essentially require somebody to go in and do movements, activities that are pushing them past their limits over a long period of time to improve. And that can be extremely effective. The challenge is that that's expensive because you have experts in care who are providing this sort of interaction over a long period of time. The geographic location that people are in can be different than where their care is received, and that can cause a problem as far as travel. Our demographics in the developed world are shifting, so our populations are aging, and that means that there are fewer people to care for an increasing number of people who need that care. And in general, we're producing fewer clinicians across the domain of clinicians to take care of these people. And then now we know another option, there's infectious diseases that can limit someone's ability to receive the care they need. All this leads to fewer patient outcomes, which could lead to fewer patient interactions, which does lead to poorer outcomes. Luckily, there are some solutions we can explore. So the first one is telepresence. And so we know telepresence, we're using it right now. It's Zoom, Skype, whatever. There are medical specific options like Teladoc. And there are options that have been researched where you can augment the experience with a tabletop game or something like that. There's also an entire space of mobile telepresence robots where the person's able to drive around and interact just with where they are in the world. These solutions lower the barriers to access because somebody can access their clinician wherever they are right now without needing to travel. They are relatively low cost in the case of things like Teladoc or Zoom, because all you need is a phone or a tablet, which you likely already have, and the internet. And they're becoming more familiar to both clinicians and patients. The challenge is these things lack physical presence. So you're not in the room with each other. And especially for something like rehab, where a lot of interaction is necessary, that can be a problem. It also flattens these 3D interactions we'd like to have into 2 dimensions, and there's a limited field of view. Another possible solution is social robots. These can lower the barrier to access by providing a robot wherever a patient may need them, even if a clinician is not there. They're physically present with the robots. You can see here, there are these social robots. They are expressing themselves, they're moving around, and they're doing activities in the same space as the patient. And that can be motivating in a kind of novel way. And it provides an opportunity for automation because you can scale this up, right? You can suddenly have 2 robots, then 5 robots, and then so on and so forth. The thing is that without a clinician there having this robot present, the system is kind of susceptible to failure because it doesn't have that expertise that a clinician has, and it's really challenged by novel situations, right? Whereas a human can really deliver and respond to novelty. And so our idea was to look at how we could take the best of both of these things. Social robot augmented telepresence is the answer to that. I'll be abbreviating it SRAT throughout. And this comes from understanding that in normal in-person interactions, there's a lot of information flows that go back and forth between the clinician and the patient. But that when you move to telepresence, these break down and you're limited in the amount of information that's traveling back and forth. So we try to add a social robot into that mix, into the existing telepresence to improve that information flow. And so that looks something like this. You've got a social robot with a face, arms, body, etc., on top of a mobile telepresence system. And we're doing this with the goals of improving communication, motivation, and so communication, the ability for people to interact with each other across this media, the patient's motivation to do activities, the clinician's ability to assess the patient, so to see how are they doing, are they improving or not, etc. The patient's compliance, so their willingness to do activities during interactions, and then their adherence, their willingness to do activities after the interaction. So oftentimes with a therapy regime, you'll come in, you'll do some activities, and then you'll be expected to go back on your own and do additional activities. And so we're trying to see, does that improve that? That would be a big deal. And so in exploring this new space, I'm going to go over 4 aims today. The first is designing and producing an example of social robot augmented telepresence. Then I'll go into how we can test, or how we did test, how patients responded to SRAT compared to classical telepresence, which you'll see abbreviated CT. And then look at how clinicians use SRAT in a long-term deployment and demonstrate telepresence-based autonomous assessment. All right, so that first aim, this is Flow. This is the robot you already saw briefly, but it's a mobile system, so it can drive around, independently powered. It's got an onboard computer with this humanoid body on it, and so the body can move around, and etc. It has speakers, microphones, a screen for a human to appear on, and then a set of cameras. And so the faces on the robot can express a series of emotions. We've tested these and validated them. And the arms have good coverage of human range of motion, the big limit being the elbow flexion. So the robot can only come to about right here, whereas I can come to all the way here. The other limitation is that the head is large enough that the robot can't quite get all the way up here. It hits a limit somewhere around here. Being able to see the patient is really important. We want to be able to see patients both close to the robot and far away. And so we align cameras like this. There are 3 cameras, 2 provide depth information, and 1 is a fisheye camera. And so you get this sort of data back where you can see both the color and the depth information of people interacting close to the robot and far away. The entire system is controlled by a web interface. This works, anywhere. We've had people from San Francisco control the robot while I was in Philly, so it's quite robust. You can drive the robot, play games with it. You can type in things for the robot to say. In addition to when it runs the games, the robot's automatically speaking. You can control the faces, load poses into it, compose poses into sequences, move through those sequences, and change the contents of games. So there are 2 built-in games. The first one is a Simon Says game, where the robot tells the patient to do something in a series of sequences, and these commands are kind of randomly assembled from a bucket of options that we have. Oh, and you know what? Let me share my audio real quickly. All right.
Simon says wave with your right arm and touch your mouth with your left hand. Good job.
And so you can see the robot's giving commands.
Swing your right arm up and down like this, and swing your left arm up and down like this.
And the patient is following as best they can. The second activity we have is a target touch activity. So here the robot is going to present dots that are on its hands and ask patients to touch a sequence of those dots. You'll also see here that the robot has the ability, or the operator has the ability to tell the robot to congratulate people or to ask them to try again and that sort of thing.
How about we give that another try?
Okay.
Right hand blue, left hand yellow, right hand yellow, go. You are doing really well.
And so the robot had asked them to try again, gave them the commands again, and then congratulated them for that.
Left hand green, go.
And then you can see that the next set of commands were given. And again, these commands, they're randomized every time. So there's a certain sequence that we want people to do in whole, but the ordering changes up so they have a novel experience each time. So a few contributions from this part of the work. The first is that we've come up with this novel design concept combining social robots and telepresence, right? And we've been able to take the expertise and flexibility of a clinician, combine it with the advantages of a physically present robot to deliver what appears to be a better tele-rehab experience. That could enable frequent care to be provided for underserved populations who are in rural areas or other places. And I also think that more generally, we push this idea in this robotic design of focusing on the core capabilities. And so we didn't have particularly strong motors in the system. It doesn't have the most advanced sensors, and there's very little advanced intelligence. It's primarily just a script-based system. We rely on the intelligence of the operator, but doing that, we were able to mitigate our costs and deploy the system very quickly, test it, and understand this kind of paradigm. So kind of continuing on from that, the next thing to do is to do some usability testing. So we did that virtually with a large cohort of clinicians. Responses were taken from June 30th, January 18th of 2020, 2021. We reached people from a variety of places: occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech and language pathologists. We had a wide variety of responses. In the survey, subjects were asked for their demographics, what kind of patients they treat, where they treat them, what COVID-19 did to their practice, what they've done with tele-rehab in the past. We showed them this introductory video of Flow, so you can't hear it, but Flow narrates out this introduction. We asked for their thoughts on Flow, and then generally features they thought would be good for tele-rehabilitation, and then some final thoughts more generally for robotics in healthcare. So interesting to a wide range of researchers. So starting off with those features and feelings, we asked, what features do you believe are useful in a system to make tele-rehabilitation work well? And I want to highlight a couple of these. So high quality video to see the patient was the #1 thing. So you can see here on this chart is that there are responses which are people rated this thing as extremely useless, somewhat useless, neutral, somewhat useful, and extremely useful. And you see the percentages for positive, negative. Oh, and I realize my pointer's not on. Hold on one second. So we have useless, useful, and then neutral in the middle. And then you've got percentages for usefulness, lack of usefulness, and neutrality here. And so high quality video, 87% of respondents said that that was useful. And if we look at a clear screen to see the clinician, also high response rate. And then automatic assessment, which this, you should have already seen a hint to this. This is that final aim of the work, is doing automated assessment of patient function. But in general, across the board, these features were generally seen as being useful, the ones we presented. Another question, in this section, we asked for some final thoughts on robotics in healthcare, so bringing it out to robotics in general. Almost all the therapists who were surveyed said that we need to study more about how robots affect function, that robots are too expensive, that they want robots that they can control. And on the opposite side, most of them said that they did not want robots that act on their own. And so I think that this is an important thing for roboticists to be thinking about when we're designing these systems. We love to automate everything. It's why we do robotics, right? But that's not necessarily what delivers the best experience for the clinician and the patient. And I think we've done a really good job here of making sure we're bringing the clinician into the interaction and seeing how they can control that going forward. So we took these two questions, we put them together, and we did a factor analysis on them to understand some of the underlying themes. And so the first one, having concerns about feasibility, the therapist did have concerns about feasibility, significantly so. They were positive on features for the social robot augmented telepresence, the kind of things that are unique to that. They didn't record any sort of significant positive feelings. They significantly felt that we needed to have more research and regulation. They significantly weren't concerned about robots negatively impacting society, so not concerned about societal concerns. And then they significantly felt that we needed to have high quality telepresence features in these as like a focus. In open-ended questions, they provided some insights for some things they would change about the flow design. So improving the voice, adding legs to it, making the more realistic hands in the system, and having a bigger screen. And we'll come back to those a little bit later too. They also had some concerns, technical challenges deploying in healthcare settings. Anybody who's done that knows that Wi-Fi just doesn't work in healthcare settings. That there are all kinds of like other little wonky things that make it harder about cleaning robots and all that sort of stuff. Reliability is a big issue. You know, this is not a space where you can have a robot that works 1 out of every 100 times and get the good video for the conference. This thing is going to be working with patients, right? And so it's got to be reliable, even in testing, even with what we do, it has to be reliable to work almost every time. Focusing on the appropriate use is also a big theme. So making sure that we're developing robots and putting them in front of the patients who need them, who will react positively to them, and not trying to replace therapists in the process. And then finally, thinking about the costs of robots and who gets paid for them, how does reimbursement work? So a few contributions. The therapists did not have negative feelings towards robots, so that's good. The specific features that therapists wanted in telerehab robots, we kind of highlighted out some of these, and we highlighted some specific concerns from therapists about robots in rehab. So now focusing in a little bit more on the flow system and social robotic augmented telepresence, we looked at how useful people thought that would be. And so we asked them, how interested would you be in using the little flow system? And what I really want to highlight here is that 27% of them had a greater than 50% response. So for a new technology that they've seen for a 3-minute video, for 27% of therapists to say like this was something they wanted to try out, that's a pretty positive response. That's exciting to us. We also asked, how do you believe that adding a social robot as a companion for your patients during video plus audio telepresence interaction, such as the little flow system, would change the following when compared with traditional video plus audio telepresence-based rehab? And so they thought that it would significantly improve communication during the interaction, significantly improve their patients' motivation during the interaction. They didn't expect to see a significant improvement in assessment. A significant number of them felt that it would improve compliance, and then there was not a significant response on adherence. So a takeaway there is that therapists believe that flow would benefit care from their patients amongst multiple of these goals that I presented earlier on in the talk. So given that we understand how therapists feel about it on like a kind of broad sense, it's next time to look at how patients respond to social robotic augmented telepresence compared to classical telepresence. And we do this in a controlled way, comparing 3 interaction modalities. So one over here is a classical telepresence interaction. You see there's a target touch board here. These points are at the same place that flow presents its hands for people to touch. And then you've got the full social robot augmented telepresence system. And then you have a podium here that's painted to look as much like the robot as one could make a podium look. Same color scheme and everything. It's got the same target touch board and the same camera setup. So for the experiment, we began with a pre-screening. Subjects came in. We consented them to participate. They did a series of clinical assessments and an intake survey. And so the clinical assessments we did were a box and block test, which measures upper extremity motor function by having the subject move blocks from one side of this container to the other, as many as they can in 60 seconds. And you just count them up. That can then be their norms that we can use for age and things like that. And so we take the norm of age and gender, and we get a normalized score across the population. Grip strength, subjects are squeezing on a dynamometer. And then for color trails, it's a trail making test. So it's like connect the dots type thing, but with some added challenge, and that measures cognitive function. So all subjects then did a face-to-face interaction and a post-experiment survey after that. We start with face-to-face interactions for everybody because we would expect in the real world, when getting therapy, everybody would get a face-to-face interaction prior to filling the gaps with telepresence-based interaction. We wanted to control that, so we created an interface that tells the operator what the robot would be doing if it was operating. So we make sure that everybody's playing the same games in all situations. And you can see here that I'm playing the Simon Says game with a patient, or with the subject rather. And then also a target touch activity. So then subjects were randomly assigned to one of 2 pathways. In one pathway, they saw a social robot first, and the other one they did classical telepresence first, and then they flipped to the other side. After each interaction, they were still doing a post-experiment survey. And between each set of interactions, there was a cool down period of at least 10 minutes. So for the classical interactions, we did the same thing where we put text on the screen for the operator so they would know what to say, where we were in the game. And so here's Simon Says, and you can see the operator is here on the screen.
Okay, cool.
And then here's target touch in the classical telepresence setting.
Simon Says reach to the side with your right arm.
And then here you've already seen the social robot augmented telepresence, Simon Says, and target touch. And then after all these interactions were complete, we had a final survey of all the subjects. So kind of to recap, they came in, they did these clinical assessments, an intake survey, face-to-face interaction, first post-experiment survey, then they did these 2 telepresence interactions, surveys after each one, and then a final survey. And so we have data from all this. The first step was to normalize these assessments or first step of the data analysis to normalize these assessments that we did at the beginning. Then I'll describe the subjects for you. And then we needed to determine the impact of the social robot augmented telepresence. But there's kind of this complexity of ordering of different operators and then of people's level of motor impairment, level of cognitive impairment, and their age. And so we use generalized linear models with an ANOVA to get at what is significant in the differences between these interactions, looking at task load using a standardized instrument, the NASA task load index, competence, enjoyment, pressure, and value using another standardized instrument, the intrinsic motivation inventory, and then finally looking at people's just rated modality preference. And so we have 38 subjects that I'm presenting here. They're quite diverse. You can see that the color trails 1 and 2 correlate quite well. We're just going to use the color trails 2 to describe people going forward. And box and block test and grip strength test correlate kind of okay. We're just going to use the box and block test going forward to describe so cognitive function and then motor function. So here you can see our subject population. Note the shape tells you what order they were in. So we did a good job of randomizing order. Age is shown in color. And really the highlight here is that this is a broad swath of patients with a variety of different levels of both motor and cognitive impairment. And just this is going to allow us to say a lot of interesting things about how different people interact with these sorts of systems. So subjects were familiar kind of with smartphones and tablets, a little bit less with computers, and not very familiar with robots, as would be expected. But they felt positively about robots. And they were neutral to positive on using video calls for healthcare. Amongst those who were currently doing therapy, they reported having high levels of adherence and having high levels of enjoyment. Before, during the intake survey, before the interactions, we asked them all to report their current effect with the self-assessment mannequin, which is a standardized tool. They reported being neutral on arousal and dominance and positive on valence, so happy. So the first of these questions that I mentioned that we'd go into is the NASA task load index. So looking at task loads, so how hard are things for people? On aggregate, you don't see much of a difference here between the different interactions indicated by color. But I mentioned we were going to use these GLMs, these generalized linear models. So we model task load as being dependent on the interaction modality. So face-to-face, classical telepresence, or social robot augmented telepresence. The cross of age, motor function, and cognitive function, represented by the box and block test and color trails test. Experimental order, which robot operator was doing the interaction. So we have multiple robot operators that interact with this thing. And then we have a term to handle that repeated measure across subjects. You can see that the highest order term that was significant is interaction modality, age, and box and block test, so motor function. Looking across these, the classical telepresence and social robot telepresence lay on top of each other for the most part, with the exception of amongst normal motor function subjects who are relatively younger, where social robot augmented telepresence, they reported as having slightly higher task load than classical telepresence. Moving on to the competence, enjoyment, pressure, and value. I want to highlight here that enjoyment looks quite a bit different in the social robot augmented telepresence, just on aggregate, than the other conditions. And again, we're going to use the same methodology to understand what's affecting these sorts of numbers. Here we look at each subscale independently, so we'll have a model for each one. So in competence, interaction modality wasn't significant, so there's nothing really we can say about it. For enjoyment, interaction modality was significant. And so we can see that it's significant both coupled with age and motor function, as well as motor function and cognitive function. So we just put those all together, even though the higher order term itself isn't significant. And a few things to highlight here. Well, first, you can see motor impairment going side to side, cognitive impairment going up and down, age within each box, and then level of enjoyment within each box as well, going up and down. And so here you can see that amongst people who have good cognitive function, so no worse than mild cognitive impairment, almost across the board, social robot augmented telepresence, which is kind of that gold line, is more enjoyable than classical telepresence, with the exception of people who are high functioning in cognition and motor function and are quite a bit older. Looking at the bottom of the chart, for people who have mild, moderate, and severe cognitive impairment, we see that amongst older subjects, the social robot augmented telepresence is more enjoyable, but amongst the younger ones, it's actually classical telepresence. So that's kind of an interesting interaction. But if at the end of this, I think that the most important thing to take away from this is that there's this really complicated interaction going on between cognitive impairment, motor impairment, and age when thinking about how someone's going to enjoy these different interaction modalities. And I think that's going to be generally applicable beyond just this sort of narrow social robot augmented telepresence. Looking at pressure, there were no significant factors. Looking at value, the interaction modality didn't play in, so it's not really interesting. We also had some other questions. We measured the quality in general across all the interactions. The quality appears to be good. And then what I think is the most interesting question is modality preference. So here we asked the subjects to rate which modality they thought was best. And you can see down at the bottom left that face-to-face receives the highest ratings, as one would expect, right? Face-to-face interactions are the gold standard. They should be. If you can get a face-to-face interaction, go for it. But if we remove the face-to-face interactions and we just look at whether classical telepresence or social robot augmented telepresence is rated higher than each other, social robot augmented telepresence outperforms classical telepresence by a factor of greater than 2 to 1. So more than twice as many people rated social robot augmented telepresence higher in their list than classical telepresence. And that's pretty cool. Again, we use the same sort of method for understanding these underlying features of impairment and age affecting modality presence. Here, the GLM uses a logic linking function because it's a binary question. But in general, what you see here is that across most parts of this board, social robot augmented telepresence is preferred over classical telepresence. It's above 50%, it's colored gold. The two places where that isn't true. So the first one amongst people who with high cognitive impairment, high cognitive function, no worse than mild motor impairment, and who are older, classical telepresence is preferred. And then amongst people who have mild, moderate, or severe cognitive impairment, severe motor impairment, and who are older all the way down to like as low as 20 years old for the most severely impaired people, then classical telepresence is more preferred there as well. And so, again, there's this hint that there's this deep sort of complexity as far as who is this technology right for, and that goes back to what the therapists were saying earlier. That they were reporting that they don't know who to put it for, and so this is starting to tell you that there are different populations for whom this is right and this is not right, and that's really an important deliverable to the community to understand what do they do with that. We asked people if they liked flow. They did. We had open-ended questions throughout, and we gathered some insights from that. So the first is that if I'm remote, this is a good way to go about doing rehab, right? And that's the point. For people who are remote, they're seeing this as valuable, and so that's good. And then Flo said something, or the second one, this is not something we expected, and this is something which has come up a few times. It's really interesting, and that's Flo is perfect for working with folks with disabilities because she is entirely non-judgmental. And so this idea that we've heard people say things like, the robot's not in a rush. The robot doesn't care if I make mistakes. And that's different than how people are perceiving humans, to be clear. And so the robot provides this new opportunity to provide a different sort of social agent. It's not human, right? People know it's not human, and they react a little bit differently. And so that's quite interesting. But there were also some responses that hinted to ways in which classical telepresence was better. So that it was easier and more natural, or that people were distracted by the robot. One subject complained that the robot didn't give feedback as often as the operator during the classical telepresence or face-to-face interactions. And so thinking about, that's not necessarily social robot augmented telepresence's fault, that's our implementation's fault. And so how can you improve the implementation? And somebody said that it would be nicer to have a larger screen. So echoing what the therapist said earlier. So a few of the contributions here. This was the very first strong evidence provided from a patient perspective that social robot augmented telepresence is viable for delivering higher quality telerehabilitation than classical telepresence. And we showed that it was more enjoyable in many situations and that it'd be more preferred by patients. We showed that the reaction to these systems can be influenced by motor function, cognitive function, and age simultaneously. And I think that, again, this is not just social robot augmented telepresence. This is social robots in general, that when you're deploying these sorts of systems with these types of populations, that it's really important that you consider the motor function, the cognitive function, the age of subjects, and not do those independently, but actually kind of holistically think about who your subject or who your patient eventually population is going to be. So moving on to that, we looked at kind of flipping the script and focusing more on the clinician experience with using these systems. So we did a long-term deployment of social robot augmented telepresence in a program for all-inclusive care for the elders. So in these sorts of settings, elders live in the community and they're bussed into the center, anywhere from 1 to 5 times a week, where they get all their therapy interactions, all of their, eye doctor and whatever. And so it's a place where they get all their care. And so what we did was we trained therapists working in one of these settings to operate the robot, and they used it with their own patients they were already doing therapy with. We asked them to use either the Simon Says or the Target Touch game. They could, of course, use both. And then we asked them to just use the robot as they wanted to, right? Perform whatever activities they thought were most interesting, most useful. And we put the therapists and the robot and patient in different rooms, right? So it was true telepresence. After every interaction, we surveyed the patients, and then we surveyed the therapist at the end of every day of interaction, so they potentially interacted with multiple patients in one day. And then again at the end of the study, and we went back and we looked at all the video of all this. So we had 11 patients participate from anywhere from 1 to 4 sessions. They're all older because of the setting, and had various levels of motor and cognitive impairment. We had 3 therapists participate, and really we'll be looking primarily at therapists 400 and 401. They just completed more interactions, but the takeaway here is that these are expert therapists. And what we're going to see is that these expert therapists can teach us a lot about how to use the system that we designed. And so I think finding expert therapists, right, we worked with therapists throughout the entire process of designing it, but finding therapists to actually use the system who aren't informed on the design as much is a really valuable way to learn what your system does. You can see here that the interactions were, again, over time. You see how that develops.
We're good at this.
And then we can take a look at an interaction.
You can put your arms down. Good job, Mr. Jackson.
Simon Says wave with your right arm and rotate your left arm like me.
That's a
All right, so a
tough
few
one,
things to highlight here. There's this kind of teaming that's going on between the social robot and the therapist,
I don't know if I could do
right?
that.
Where they're both talking,
That's a tough
they're
one.
taking on different parts of the interaction, and the patient is clearly
All right,
enjoying
we'll do
themselves,
one
right? They're
more.
laughing through these interactions.
Simon Says touch your mouth with your right hand and touch your left hand to your right shoulder.
And you can see here that the patient got a little confused as to which shoulder he was supposed to be going to here. So the 2 therapists used the system actually quite differently. Therapist 401 averaged longer 25-minute interactions, and they heavily customized what the robot was saying by typing things in. They began with a personalization activity where they introduced the robot. They had the patient name the robot, and they had kind of a conversation to build rapport with the patient. And so they ended that with the robot and the patient knowing each other. An orientation check where the robot asks the patient, and again, they're typing all this in, things about like who's the president, what time is it, so know if they were well oriented in the space. They checked the patient's level of pain. Again, the robot was asking this. In some cases, they did something interesting where the robot's faces were used to ask this. So they presented like different levels of pain on the faces. They did a manual motor activity. This looks almost like Simon Says, but I think the therapist wanted more control over the interaction, so they actually ran their own poses and sequences and gave commands themselves. Then they did the Simon Says activity. They did this customized activity they took from Tai Chi. They called gathering the chi, and so that you ask the patient to put their arms by their side and go overhead and then pull down with the breathing activity. They do this in their care normally, and so they actually, again, we didn't come up with this. They innovated that on their own and put it on the robot. And they did a final farewell. Right, a bunch of these things are new to us. We hadn't come up with this personalization activity or this orientation check or this pain check or the gathering the chi activity. And so they really built on top of the system. For Therapist 400, they were a little bit shorter. They had a very short introduction with the robot. Then they would go into a Simon Says game, a Target Touch game, similar sort of pain check in some of the trials. They used the other therapist gathering the chi activity in some of their trials, and then a brief farewell. The thing that they did that was a little bit different is that they made heavy use of those commands on the robot to say things like try harder or you're doing a great job. And they really leaned into using as much of the robot's built-in capabilities as possible. So very different perspectives here between heavy customization and heavy use of what's built in. Looking through the videos, there are a few challenges we noticed. So the robot's voice was too fast or unclear for some of this patient population. They were confused. You saw about the handedness and, well, Simon Says, but also in the Target Touch game. But yeah, so looking at the therapist experience though, measuring their task load, what you can see is that their effort was low, their enjoyment was moderate, their frustration was low, mental demand was moderate, but it went down over time. Their performance was moderate initially, but went up to good, and the physical demand was low. And so I think across the board, we see what we would like to see in these interactions, certainly by the end, but initially performance was a little bit lower than we would like, and demand was a little bit higher. And so the question going forward is really, how do you make the system easier for them to use here, so that they're not having to train over time on it. They can use it effectively day one. Looking at how the therapists rated the quality of the interaction here, enjoyment is their patient's enjoyment. They felt that they could assess the patients. It went from fair to good by the end. They had good communication. Their patients expressed good compliance. They enjoyed it. Their patients were motivated. The patients understood what they're supposed to do. So overall, we're just seeing a rating of high quality of interaction here. We asked, what can social robot augmented telepresence be used for? Where can it be useful? And I think the highlight here is that they really disagree on that. The one place they do agree is for rural outpatient clinics right here. They think that social robot augmented telepresence would be useful there. And to be honest, that's where we initially designed it to go. So that's kind of cool to see. They answered open-ended questions as well. And so they talked about the novelty and engagement that the social robot brings compared to just having standard telepresence. But also there's kind of a lack of flexibility. So once you run the games, you can customize in the beginning. You can change what's in the game. You can change how hard it is, number of repetitions, that sort of thing. But once it starts running, that's it. And so that caused problems for them. And then one of them, the therapist who was really typing in everything that they were doing to customize, that caused challenges for them in latency with the voice. But really, I think this highlights a central challenge, which is that the experience for patients was good by the therapist's estimation, and they were able to use the system, but then it increased the difficulty of the common tasks they needed to do. And so I think that's kind of the challenge going forward, is how do we take from the patient focus and also do the therapist focus. Thinking about the patient experience, their task load was right where we would want it to be. It was low frustration, high performance, and then their effort and demand were kind of all over the place, which is, you don't want therapy to be too easy. So if it was all low mental demand, that would be a bad thing. They rated their quality of interaction across a bunch of metrics as being high. Using the intrinsic motivation index, they reported being competent, enjoying the interactions, having low pressure, giving the interactions high value, and they reported that they liked flow. A bunch of them in open-ended questions reported that they enjoyed the system. A couple of highlights. One said that it was different, it was fun, they'd be happy to do it any time. But one of them said, and again, hinting back to what I said earlier, it was nice, I understood exactly what was asked of me. The robot didn't criticize me if I got it wrong. I really enjoyed it. And so again, this really interesting idea that we really just did not see coming, of people viewing robots as less critical social agents than humans. And so that's kind of cool. But again, this question of making sure we focus on the right patient with the right robot for what they need. One said the activities are too easy, not effective. The program should be focused on the patient's disability. And so, yeah, we just need to make sure that as we develop robots, as we deploy them, they're focused on what the patient needs. A few contributions from this work. This was the first long-term deployment of social robot augmented telepresence. We were able to complete 23 interactions. That's incredibly hard to do, to do 23 interactions in an uncontrolled clinical setting with real clinicians who are not experienced with robots, using the robot with real patients who are not experienced with robots either. We're just extremely pleased with our ability to do that. This was the first instance of social robot augmented telepresence being used by clinicians with their patients. And they found these new ways to use the system. So I think a higher level takeaway for other roboticists is just build your system good enough and give it to your users, especially in this space. And the expertise of the therapists will tell you what's not working and future ways you can develop it, right? We have all these new ways that the robot was used to do these various social interactions and doing Tai Chi moves and things like that. But the system led to too high of task load. And so now the next step is kind of take these things that we didn't automate because we wanted to give clinician control and say, okay, which are the things we can automate to lower the task load and still maintain clinician control where they want it. And then patients reported high enjoyment. So again, we see that the patient experience is quite good. And then moving on to this fourth aim here, this autonomous assessment of upper extremity rehab, upper extremity function during telerehab using computer vision. The idea here is that you can do assessments. So you can determine what my level of motor function is, how well is my elbow or shoulder doing via video. People have been doing that for a long time, and especially during COVID, but it presents a challenge in that you need a lot of expertise and training on doing that. And it requires this extra load on the clinician. So either they're having to really focus on the screen, this kind of foreign modality, or they have to go back later and they have to rewatch the video. And so as therapists reported, they really want a way to do this in an autonomous fashion. So we are going to look at how that could be done. So we take the data from our controlled study, and we partition into two groups, a test data set and a development data set. And the test data set is well balanced across age and levels of impairment. We're taking video from the target touch activity and the Simon Says game in both the classical telepresence and the social reward augmented telepresence condition. And then, of course, every subject has two arms. We treat those arms independently because in reality, they oftentimes are for this population. The general idea is to take video from the Simon Says game, find the joint positions of that, use that to develop an idea of the range of motion of the patient. And then we tried out both regression to the box and block test or classification to the level of motor function using box and block test scores to kind of develop levels. And then we also use target touch video, finding the kinematics of the wrist to develop a set of features, and that's feeding into the same models, right? So it's these models take both of these things in and then put one of these outputs out. So beginning to look at the target touch activity, we took the video from the upper real sense, that's the one's looking down, the upper camera. We ran a media pipe on just the color image, so that gives you an idea of where the hands are in 2D. We mapped that out to 3D using the camera's depth, and then we just looked at the places where the target touch activity was being done, and you can see the results here. We filtered that a little bit more using a Hampel filter, and then we applied a Kalman smoother over it. And this is something that I actually haven't seen done a whole lot. The traditional technique is you take some sort of smooth version of your positions and you take numerical derivatives of that, and you get a really noisy signal by the time you get to acceleration. Instead, what I did was I treated the position, the velocity, and the acceleration all as hidden states. And then I treated what we were getting out of the video and the pose detection as just an observation of those hidden states and use that to get back at them. A couple of important notes about the Kalman smoother under the hood. Position was only allowed to evolve relative to velocity, so there was no noise going into the position term. Velocity only evolved due to acceleration, and then acceleration evolved due to a Gaussian centered on 0, with a standard deviation set to match what you would expect a reasonable level of jerk to be for these sorts of motions on the wrist. And so it's really, this is not like a tuned Kalman smoother, this is a physics-informed one. And you can see the results look pretty reasonable at a distance. We took these segments, or this, across the entire target touch game. We split it out by speed thresholding, so looking at, just where individual motions, and then also by local minima. Took segments that were too short, and essentially what we want to be looking at is, for most features, like if you wanted to say, like, how long did it take someone to reach their maximum speed, you wouldn't look at that over the entirety of an entire game. You'd say, okay, so for each motion, how long did it take for them to reach their top speed? And so this, we split into these segments, so we can do that. A couple things to note here. The first one is that you can see the raw data in this blue box here actually drops out. So the kind of like thicker line is gone. One of the things that Kalman smoother buys is it fills that in with a reasonable set of values. The second thing to look at is that even with this slightly more complex motion with more complex kinematics, you're seeing a very clean signal come out. That doesn't mean that I can't tell you that it's the most accurate signal, but at least it's a signal we can work with. And that the Kalman smoother has bought us that as well. That would not be the case if we use numerical differentiation. And so then we, for each segment, we calculated a series of kinematic measures. These are well understood, well studied in the literature. And then we took the median over all the segments for each feature. So we were eliminating segments that were dirty, hopefully. You can see there are still some places where we have some large outliers in some of this data. But we'll come back and try to understand this a little bit more in a minute. For the Simon Says game, we looked at the lower camera, so looking forward. We grabbed the pose data using open pose, did the same sort of game with gathering depth using the depth cameras directly. And did the same sort of filtering and then Kalman smoothing. So for the wrist, this is going to be exactly the same as it was for the previous activity. Then for the elbow, we're of course using slightly different numbers under the hood for like how you would expect the elbow to move, what reasonable levels of jerk would be. But the other thing we do is we decrease the confidence anytime the wrist is overlaying the elbow. And then for the shoulder, we only went out to the first derivative. You don't really expect to be moving as much, but it's the same sort of thing. And here we decrease confidence anytime the entire forearm is laying over the shoulder. What this allows us to then do is to look over the entirety of the activity. What was the range that the person was able to reach? And so we subtract the wrist out from the shoulder. We lay a convex shape over those points. And then we find the surface area and the volume of whatever's in there. And we also try normalizing that. So taking the surface area relative to the square of arm length and taking the volume relative to the cube of arm length, both of which are measured directly from this because we can measure real metric distances because we have depth data. You can see again, there are some outliers. If you look at the kind of reasonable data that's there. So our first thing to do was to try to do regression on all these features together. Using cross-validation, I tried a bunch of different regression techniques. Under the hood here, I'm doing normalization as you would expect me to do. What you can see here is you immediately get a hint that these outliers are really wrecking this because Ransak's errors in the cross-validation are wildly different than the other models. And you don't really get, these numbers don't really give you confidence that we're going in the right direction with regression. I think that maybe regression, giving our size of the data set and using the metrics we're using, is a step too far. And so instead, I decided to try to look at classification. And so here we grouped each subject into their mild, moderate, severe, or no levels of motor impairment, and then tried a bunch of different classification techniques. Random forest of decision trees did the best with 50 estimators. We did a grid search around that to figure out what was really the best. Results are shown here. In cross-validation, the F1 macro score was 0.48, which would be good. I told you we'd come back to those features and try to understand, what's important. And so we did that by taking each feature, making it into random noise, and seeing how that affected our ability to accurately classify the subjects in cross-validation. You can see that normalized jerk performs the best, followed by maximum acceleration over average acceleration, time to max speed, onwards. So you can see that their importance here. Again, these are all taken from the literature. So now we can see this is, I think, not so much a metric of which of these are the best metrics on whole, but which of them are we able to do the best at with this type of pipeline. But that can inform some future work. And then we deployed this, what we had determined was the best model in the test set, and Flo was sad about it. You can see that on the diagonal, so what you're seeing here is the true values and the predicted values, and that you'd like to see all the data on the diagonal, and it's not there. What is kind of interesting is that a large portion of the remaining data is on the single off diagonal. There's not actually a whole lot of data past that. And so it kind of seems like we might be doing an okay job predicting one level of impairment off. But still, it's not, I think that there's a lot of room to improve here. Things that weren't done, right? I did not handle the outliers at all. I did not treat the upper extremity as a rigid system, right? I treated it as independent points floating around for the wrist, elbow, and shoulder. There was a limited number on the previous slide of features I implemented. There could be many more features, and you could try to learn better features. I think there's some places where some nonlinearities come in when you're moving around that could be better captured. And certainly, the biggest thing to me, our pose detection ignores 3D data. Why? That's what we do. There's like a whole space of pose detection stuff that needs to be improved. And I think Conrad has talked a lot about this in the past. So I refer you to his papers on that. So some contributions. This is the first attempt that we have done at making a pipeline for understanding upper extremity impairment from this tele-rehab video. We did it using this course of experience we ran. It provides a jumping off point for further work. So we've collected all this data and we have the skeleton of an algorithm complete. So now people can kind of go in and affect individual modules. And I think I kind of come away at the end asking whether the box and block test was really the right measure to target. I think that perhaps recoding some of this video for motor impairment using some expertise from therapists as opposed to using the numerical box and block test would be better. I'm not confident that box and block test was giving the numbers we really can model against. So now coming kind of full circle and going back to the design, I want to, we've talked about all these different ways we've tested the system, and that can inform the design going forward. And so my hope is that somebody else takes this on and they continue to develop the system. And so some recommendations really for that person. The telepresence system componentry is obviously critical. The system needs to have a bigger screen in the future. We actually have high quality microphones at this point, but we didn't initially. That turns out to be super, super important. And then there was some reports of the cameras making people nervous. So like concealing the cameras to make people more engaged, I think would be a positive. I think the social robot, you saw that even though its range of motion was good, the limits that were there, people were still getting confused. When you ask someone to reach to their right shoulder and the robot kind of goes to here instead of all the way to here, they're like, oh, that's kind of in the middle, and they don't really know where to go. So improving that range of motion, having more realistic hands. We saw people who were clenching their fists because the hands are like mitts, and so probably having things that look more like fingers, adding legs in, and then improving the speech. And I think that improving the speech is actually pretty simple. You just expose to the operator the speed of the speech, the register of the speech, things that are all already built in, and then let them kind of pick for their patient population what's best. I think there's a lot of opportunity to develop more activities for therapy, as well as improve the game so they can be dynamically adapting as the therapy goes on. And then there are a lot of places now for system automation, right? And like I cautioned earlier that you got to be careful about automating things, but now we tested the system and now we know places that are really frustrating for therapists to use. So things like controlling the emotions of the robot. Therapists sometimes forgot to like click the buttons to change the face of the robot. Having always on pose estimation, which 5 years ago we didn't have the technology for, but now we do. Would enable you to have automation of the games further. And so there were, some people talk about how like it was hard to run the games, and so providing some of that. Nobody cares to drive a robot around, so having it autonomously navigate. And then I think the big thing is having some sort of predictive speech engine. So right now you have to type in everything you want the robot to say. I think that could be improved. And then finally, just from a technical perspective, there's some system componentry that needs to be improved on the system. I think the real highlight here is the height adjustable system. I haven't talked about it at all, but we did some testing in a hospital environment where patients were on hospital beds. And it turns out a robot that's kind of short doesn't work for people who are on a tall hospital bed. And so having a system that can adjust up to that sort of height, I think would be useful. And there were also some patients who said they wished the robot was a little bit taller, a little bit shorter to interact with them. So in conclusion, my overall contributions, I created Flow, which was this exemplar of social robot augmented telepresence, a new paradigm for delivering care. I completed this really uniquely large-scale usability and utility testing. We had over 300 therapists respond to those usability tests. I evaluated the effect of the social robot on telepresence in controlled experiments. And in doing that, I demonstrated the complexity of interactions between the age, motor function, and cognitive function of patients, and whether they were going to prefer different modalities and how they were going to feel about them and the levels of enjoyment. And so I think that this is like generally applicable again to social robotics. And then I tested the social robot augmented telepresence in the wild. Again, that's very hard to do. And I created this baseline pipeline for automated assessment of upper extremity motor functions. People can build off that. And then finally, I updated some of these design requirements for the next generation of social robot augmented telepresence. This work has led to a ton of publications. They're shown here. And then, of course, this wasn't an individual effort, right? This was, I intentionally used we throughout most of the talk, even though it's not always what's done in the thesis, because this was really a team effort. I think, first of all, I need to thank Dr. Johnson. She brought me to Penn. She supported me. She told me not to quit a bunch of times. She opened the doors that I needed opened. She provided the technical guidance that I needed, and taught me how to do research, which I think is the crux of the PhD, right? The PhD isn't about developing your knowledge of some sort of algorithm or your ability to build some sort of technical mechanism. It's really about like, can you hypothesize? Can you figure out how to test that hypothesis? Can you go do it? And then can you determine whether you like answered your questions, whether you did the things? And I think that she's really taught me how to do those things. I also want to thank, Dr. Cording, Prosser, Mendonça, and Cho, who have all in their respective spaces kind of mentored me and showed me how to do these things better. And so, opening doors in clinics, providing access to therapists, providing understanding of different spaces, all very important. I want to thank, a ton of students who've worked with me. That's probably been the most fun part of the PhD. Sometimes the doing data analysis at 3 a.m. gets old, but mentoring students never does. It's always cool to see them grow. Yeah, so they have moved on to do cooler things. I'm emotional today. Sorry. It's 5:30 in the morning for me. Yeah, it's just been very, very cool to learn from them. I have some lifelong friendships from that group. Obvious thanks to the NIH. They have funded a lot of this work. And then not shown here is a huge community of support. My wife is somewhere over here watching this talk. She has supported me throughout the last few years, really dealt with me being married to a second thing, which is the thesis. My family has been incredibly supportive throughout the entire process, continues to motivate me forward. A ton of friends at Penn and beyond helped to support me. And then, of course, somewhere asleep is Abida. I think anybody who knows me knows Abida. She's been my constant companion throughout the PhD. She's supported not just me, but countless other PhD students late at night in the lab, keeping them moving forward. So yeah, thanks for coming out. I hope that you saw interesting things. I hope you saw things that showed you how robotics can be exciting in the rehab space. And any questions y'all have here or on YouTube or wherever, please throw them out.
Great job. Thank you. That's virtual applause. And we've got about 4 minutes or so, or we can be a little bit longer for the public question portion. I guess we could do, if you want to type something in chat or unmute or raise hand, however you'd like to do it. Or
Michael,
if there's any.
I have a question. So this is Rochelle. Great job, Michael. This was, I've been through part of this journey, but haven't really seen it. So how extensive this was and how well you described it was brilliant. This was great. So first, congratulations. Second, when you talked about some of your studies, you had this range of participants that you had. Do you see a space for any of these kind of interventions for people who are both motorically as well as cognitively impaired? Because we didn't really talk about that severely. And I know there's really no current robotic or any other type of effective interventions for those populations. Do you see this meeting that need? Maybe not right now, but in some way through some things you've learned from your dissertation? Yeah,
so I think, we had a significant population here who had both motor and cognitive impairment. And I will be very careful to not say that we have determined efficacy of anything here, right? We were looking at interaction measures, not like, does this make therapy better? But I think certainly it's a viable mechanism for some parts of this population. I do think that when we look at, some of these groups, it does become harder. And I can add some color to this, right? When you look at people who are severely cognitively and motor impaired, their ability to interact with any sort of technical system has become very much limited. And so I think that the reality is that if you are severely impaired in a motor domain across both limbs, these systems are probably not the right system for you. But we saw people who did have severe impairment across only one limb. Right. And this is like something we didn't consider, right? We didn't talk about like bimanual anything here. It gets too complex. But people who had like totally unusable limbs, they were able to use their other limb. And so they've got significant motor impairment, potentially cognitive impairment. But I definitely don't think there's any reason why you couldn't use both these systems. I think that part of what's cool about this work is that we're really, to your point, some of the very few people who look at those things together. Right. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
That does. Thank you.
Cool. It looks like Spencer has a question.
Yeah. Hey, Michael.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So the real-time motion capture of the system looks like a really important component of making this thing actually effective in the real world. But that conflicts a little bit, as you said, with the cameras being intimidating. I know you had a little bit of a hard time getting really accurate motion caption data when, say, the wrist was directly aligned with elbow and things like that, and that could be augmented with additional cameras. How do you balance that out between the intimidation of adding those extra cameras and the additional data that you can get from adding more sensors?
Yeah, so I think that the sensors we have provide the data we need. I don't think we're yet using that data to its full potential. So if you look at what some of the machine learning people have done, and I mean, like even intuitively, right? If you see me like this, like I have overlaid my elbow here, and you can't actually see it with the camera, so you can't grab depth data here directly from if my webcam was a depth camera. But you know exactly where my shoulder is, right? As like a human. And so if we can figure that out, then a computer should be able to as well. The challenge is that just people aren't building the algorithms, and the algorithms are out of scope for us realistically to build, right? We don't have the kind of power to build full RGBD pose detection end to end like that right now. Other people do, other researchers. And so I think like my call is to kind of punt it off to the computer vision people and say like, hey, stop just, thinking very hand wavingly about just webcams and start thinking about, some higher level sensors. If you have depth data coming in, can you build something that actually gives us the full pose back? I think the other challenge you see a lot of times is that all of these algorithms, or almost all these algorithms for pose detection, are single frame algorithms. So they don't do any sort of real in-time optimization. And that is beginning to change, but the newer things that do that are running a little bit slow. That being said, I'm like really excited by some of the work done by some of our colleagues at Penn. So Pro HMR is an example of a system that does a really good job, and I've been told that it could be kind of modified to do some of these things that I'm talking about. So I would not recommend adding more cameras. I think that if you've got a single view on the subject's limbs, on the patient's limbs, that needs to be good enough, and the technology needs to overcome it beyond that.
Great, thank you. Yeah,
thank you for coming. I also see a message from John in the chat. He asks, can Flow be used to train physical therapists in the future by interacting with its arms and limbs? So I think he's talking about like training new therapists.
Hi, Mike. Yes,
hey.
I'm wondering. Hi, this is great work, by the way. Thank you. Yes, I'm wondering. As you're applying it to patients, could it also be used as a simulation / training device or modality to train? The reason I ask this is many of our babies who go home in the NICU have some neurological impairment, and then we would love to train parents on how to do physical therapy on the babies. And so, perhaps Flow can be used as a training, device or modality. So
interesting. Yeah, so I think I would extend out from just saying Flow, and I probably wouldn't ask social robot augmented telepresence being used, but I think social robots in general, that seems like a really interesting application, right? Creating systems that they can bring home. And I guess you could do that over telepresence. You could imagine sending something home where an expert trainer can remote in. I guess
they can do that, yes. But the remote trainer can't feel the pressure that potentially a learner is putting on a limb or things like that. So
yeah, so I think that with the systems we've developed so far, we've been very careful to not creep with what the system can do. And I would say that's like a positive, not a negative. So it doesn't really have very good force sensing. It's got significantly limited force sensing. It just provides safety to where, like, if it hits something, it's going to not keep hitting it. It just turns itself off. So this system could not provide that sort of force feedback. I certainly think you could design a system that did in a similar sort of way. There'd be some questions as to whether this is like the right interface to do that with. But yeah, I think it definitely could be done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the public or public questions from the committee? Okay, wonderful work. Let's give Michael another virtual round of applause.
Thanks, y'all.
And then now we will.
Mark, it looks like you had a question from a Russ. A hand up.
I meant to clap instead of raise my hand, so no question. But great job, Michael. Great job.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will now ask the public to drop out, turn off the recording, stop this YouTube stream, and we'll go to our closed session.